Welcome back, everyone. This is going to conclude our section on designing and implementing name resolution on Azure, or in other words, working with DNS. Before we move on to our next section, let's quickly review the primary concepts that we learned and also revisit our case study scenario to further reinforce what we have learned. In this section, we started off with a high-level overview of Azure DNS topics, or in other words, working with the phone book of the internet. We learned how DNS translation comes in both the public and private varieties, and then we also focus on the Azure-specific DNS topics that we would be focusing on in this section, which include working with public and private DNS zones. We then moved on to focusing on working with public DNS zones on Azure by first going through a simplified overview of the general public DNS resolution process, and then we learned how to implement that process on Azure by working with an Azure DNS zone. Next, we turned our focus to private DNS, which has a bit more ground to cover, in which we covered the variety of private DNS options on Azure, which include Azure Provided Name Resolution, Azure Private DNS Zones, and a more manual customer-managed DNS server option. We then further expanded on working with private DNS zones by talking about a couple of different implementation methods based on our specific scenarios. We first focused on how to implement Azure Private DNS Zones, focusing on the relationships between automatic and manual records. And we then covered a hybrid scenario for DNS resolution in which an on-premises network needs to forward DNS queries against Azure resources, in which we learned the proper solution is to use an on-premises DNS server, which then forwards queries to a DNS server that exists in your virtual network. Next, let's revisit our case study scenario featuring our favorite fictional bakery, Control-Alt-Suites. As Control-Alt-Suites continues to expand their global footprint, they've found they have two unique DNS-based needs that they need to solve. The first is that they need to move their public DNS hosting or implementation over to their Azure environment because they want to use the same tools to manage their public DNS records as the rest of their growing Azure environment. Second, they also need to implement on-premises communication with Azure, in which they have a number of internal servers that must communicate with Azure virtual machines via DNS hostname. So given what we have learned so far in this section, how can we best implement both of these two requirements that you see? Well, let's start by focusing on the public DNS implementation, or configuring their public DNS zones. As we learned, the preferred method for doing so is to implement an Azure DNS zone, which will have the ability to manage public DNS records using the Azure tools they are already familiar with. We also learned how that process requires first creating an Azure DNS zone, and then after creating your new DNS records, configuring your domain registrar with a new name server configuration, which will point to Azure DNS. Moving on, let's think about our second requirement, in which we need to implement DNS queries from our on-premises environment to our Azure environment. As we learned earlier, we learned that Azure Private DNS Zone, the managed service, is not the solution because that service is able to handle only Azure-based DNS queries. Rather, the preferred solution is to create a customer-managed DNS server that the customer manages on their own in the same virtual network as their virtual machines. After this separate DNS server or virtual machine is created in your virtual network, you can then configure your on-premises DNS server to forward Azure-based queries to the virtual network-based DNS server, which will then be able to provide DNS query resolution back to the on-premises network. With that, that's going to conclude this section on working with DNS on Azure. Let's now go ahead and move on to the next section.